Excellent. As was mentioned, I'll be talking a little bit about blogging this morning, in particular, wartime blogging. In this brief talk, I argue that the important subgenre of the blog, known as the mil blog or military blog, as well as the increasing trend of non-journalist civilians blogging from war zones, collapses the distinction between a writer's unedited juvenilia and their more mature published work. Just as the traditional blog blurs the authorial roles of diarist, memoir, journalist, nonfiction writer, etc., so too does blogging from conflict zones problematize the binaries of witness and participant, amateur and professional, and public and private. Furthermore, I suggest that the publication life, if you will, of mil blogs, from spontaneous online post to published bound text assigned on college syllabi, has not as of yet been adequately considered. Alexander Gallon argues how mil blogs are curiously underexplored, with most articles about them published in the popular press, in trade journals, or law journals. The field of literature, and indeed perhaps bibliography, has been slow in bringing to bear their respective lenses of analysis, and in this paper, I hope to intervene, however minimally, in that respect. Some questions to consider. How should we study mil blogs? What criteria do we marshal to evaluate them? In what form do we assign and teach them to our undergraduates? Most importantly, how do we track the evolution of a single mil blog from informal online experiment to bound book with an ISBN number? These questions are just a few of the queries that sit at the margins of this presentation. Alyssa Miller notes, quote, that in 2003, Iraq war blogs began emerging from the vast bubbling sea of the internet, providing an alternative or supplementary source of orientation and information for participants in and followers of conflict, in particular, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Excuse me, end quote. Between 2005 and 2017, the site milblogging.com served as the primary index for such blog, and at its height accounted for 1,800 blogs across 30 countries, though the vast majority of them were maintained by US service members in Iraq or Afghanistan. On the reach and importance of such blogs, Miller also notes that one of the most popular, A Line in the Sand, a blog maintained by Chris Missick, quote, eventually logged somewhere north of 100,000 page views. No blogging record, of course, but it does rival the wonkish audience for the Pentagon's daily briefings on C-SPAN or Department of Defense press releases, end quote. All of which is to illustrate the pervasive nature or the fact that there was a readership in its height of war blogs. Finally, in 2007, President George Bush appeared before a group of mil bloggers online to thank them for their, quote, unique service, which elevated the profile of the genre as a whole. So on the one hand, mil blogs participate in high culture. They are undeniably relevant, almost always authentic, often vibrate with an intimate intensity that only the witness, testimonial, and confessional genres have traditionally commanded. They are, at times, purchased and handled by prestigious publishing houses, which elevates what might start as online journal entries to canonical texts assigned alongside remarks All Quiet on the Western Front and Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. Paradoxically, mil blogs also participate in low culture. At first, they may be hastily posted and chaotically unedited. They're young 20-something digital native authors. This isn't always the case, but it's overwhelmingly the case. Maybe juvenile, brash, and emboldened by the mechanisms of self-publishing, emboldened by social media's normalization of, quote, oversharing, and emboldened by the anonymity or semi-anonymity of writing online. Even after being vetted by publishing industry standards, they may remain deeply subjective, burdened with the albatross of their dubious genre. And by this I mean, especially in 2020, we might say, what medium is more suspect, more passé, more kitsch, its presence sort of more alarming in an undergraduate's research paper's works cited list than an early 2000s blog? Having said that, wartime writing, especially in the minimally mediated, raw form of mill blogging, relies too much, I suggest, on the gravity of its subject matter to sustain the gravitas of the genre. The genre is held loosely to inconsistent standards that are partially journalistic, partially literary, and partially something else entirely. Jessica Siegel notes that, quote, in many ways, the production of the mill blog itself is a moral claim made by the mill blogger for the public to listen to their account. Thus, in early iterations, they may be animated by the authority of bearing firsthand witness, which, while always powerful, is hardly objective. And yet, despite their potential to be the defining medium of the post-9/11 wars, the first wars in which computer and internet fluency is assumed of most participants, spectators, and critics, mill blogs do not seem to possess any genuine staying power. Novels, films, and traditional long-form journalism, not blogs, are the defining mediums of the Iraq War and the War on Terror. For example, the 2014 National Book Award in Fiction was won by Phil Cly for his traditionally published collection of short stories, Redeployment. Similarly, since 2001, the New York Times has received 10 Pulitzer Prizes alone just for its reporting having to do with 9/11 and the subsequent wars. Finally, Clint Eastwood's 2014 film, American Sniper, remains far and away the highest grossing war movie of all time, surpassing even Platoon and Saving Private Ryan, etc., etc. More examples abound. Overall, despite the upstart nature of blogs, social media, and the so-called democratization of citizen journalism, for better or for worse, the most influential narratives about conflicts in the 21st century still exist in familiar mediums handled by established collaborative institutions, teams, we might say, rather than individuals. Yet, despite their marginal status, mill blogs offer unique case studies for those interested in the bibliographic life of hybrid texts. In particular, let us examine briefly two such blogs. The first, Kaboom, K-A-B-O-O-M, sort of onomatopoeia, by Matt Gallagher, and Baghdad Burning, by an anonymous Iraqi woman who publishes only under the name Riverbend. For those unfamiliar with Gallagher and Riverbend's work, I'll provide some very brief background for both authors. In 2005, at the age of 22, Matt Gallagher joined the US Army as a second lieutenant and completed 2 tours of duty in Iraq, particularly in Greater Baghdad, from 2007 to 2009. During the first year of his deployment, he maintained one of the first mill blogs, Kaboom, documenting his thoughts and experiences. In June of 2008, Kaboom was shut down by the US military after Gallagher posted about turning down a promotion to captain in order to remain with his current unit. So groundbreaking was Gallagher's command of the nascent mill blog medium, both in order to capture his daily experience and to vent, somewhat unprofessionally perhaps, in real time, that the Washington Post and other major news outlets ran features in 2008 about the rise and fall of the mill blog. Though it was, following the censor, only available via the Wayback Machine, an online digital archive that tracks defunct web pages, it has since been brought back online. Gallagher posted arguably more mature material on the blog, though less frequently, until 2010. At the height of its popularity, the Washington Post estimates that the site received 25,000 visitors a month. In 2010, Gallagher published with Capo Press in New York City an edited version of the blog as a memoir, Kaboom, Embracing the Suck in a Savage Little War, received almost universally positive reviews, including from the New York Times. Since then, Gallagher has completed an MFA at Columbia University, published 2 novels, and edited numerous collections. Currently, he teaches at New York University and has won various awards for his subsequent writing. Now regarding Riverbend, quickly. Though much less is known about Riverbend, what is known is fascinating. In her first blog post, and it is a blog, not a mill blog, since its author is not a member of the military, that appeared on Sunday, August 17, 2003, the author writes, quote, "I'm female, Iraqi, and 24. I survived the war. That's all you need to know. End quote. Immediately, a painful irony. Equal parts Paul Fussel's The Great War in Modern Memory and President Bush's cringeworthy 2003 victory speech aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln in front of an enormous mission accomplished banner is apparent in Riverbend's reference to the war in the past tense. The Iraq War would, of course, drag on officially for another 8 more years. Between 2003 and 2007, Riverbend, who reveals that she worked as a computer programmer before the war, live blogged the American-led invasion and occupation of Baghdad, the first text of this type. She posts in fluent English. Her tone is variously engaged, heartbroken, rhetorical, and comedic. In 2003, she posted that she and her family were fleeing to Syria to escape war, another tragic irony, after which all posting ended. In 2013, she reappeared briefly and added a 10 years on post before disappearing again. Like Gallagher, Riverbend's blog has been published by major American academic press and has received numerous literary awards. In 2005, the first volume, Baghdad Burning, Girl Blog from Iraq, was published by the City University of New York Press, and in 2009, a second volume was published, edited by James Ridgway. Just as sociologist Max Reinrich said that, quote, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, end quote, so too might we say that a war memoir is a diary with a free press and a stable publishing infrastructure. While Gallagher's work was eventually embraced by this infrastructure, and he remains a successful author because of it, there was, of course, no stable Iraqi publishing industry after or during the war capable of handling Riverbend's manuscript. In an eerie turn of events, her text enjoys vivid literary life in bookstores and on syllabi across the Western world, while she herself has disappeared. Blogs like those maintained by Gallagher and Riverbend occupy a curious literary and editorial space where much is contradictory and much is unresolved. Gallagher's blog is variously crude and insightful, juvenile and wise. Its earliest iterations are not vetted by either an editor or a censor, which gives the blog this irresistibly raw, unfiltered quality. As Michael Caron outlines in Narrative and Image in the Commemoration of War, we experience in such diary-style mill blogs a kind of, quote, narratorial ground zero, where we see the very moment when consciousness turns into memory. In Gallagher's case, this means readers have what amounts to a transcript of exactly what a 23-year-old Army officer felt, saw, said, and most importantly, thought was worth posting to a blog, which at times functions as a kind of deployment era MySpace or Facebook page. Pardon me. Despite the fact that the 2007 blog iteration of Kaboom and the 2010 published version are often referred to interchangeably, significant differences exist between the two. Blogs are, by nature, dialogic. They invite daily comments, responses, and readerly input in a way that traditionally published books do not. As Frank Uzbek notes, some mill bloggers, quote, even developed stylized and repetitive approaches to their audience, as in the introduction of regular blog features or fixed phrases for particular events and thoughts. The audience, in return, provides support, appreciation, and affirmation, often in stylized and repetitive phrases. Some even sacralize the bloggers by praising their service and humbling themselves correspondingly, end quote. Thus, mill blogs in their most basic form can be understood almost like William Wordsworth's original definition of poetry, cliche or trite as it may be, as, quote, emotion recollected in tranquility. It also serves a therapeutic, journalistic, epistolary, and forum function. The author finds time during deployment to capture and publish their reflections in real time. As Uzbek goes on to say, quote, bloggers sort out recent events and experiences through writing in real time. These periods often become cherished, highly self-conscious, highly ceremonial moments of reflection in their everyday routine, end quote. More permanent bound texts move slower and bear the imprint of the crowd, writers, checkers, etc. They are, of course, reviewed by lawyers and deemed likely to garner readerly interest without inviting legal action. And I see that I'm about at time here. I have about perhaps 90 seconds more. Differences are also apparent in the critical and popular reception of both texts. Wired magazine praises Gallagher's Kaboom as, quote, reckless, outspoken, and absurd, a latter-day jarhead by Anthony Swafford, a flippant dismissal of out-of-touch military bureaucracy. The Wall Street Journal calls it entertaining, comic, and irreverent, something Ken Kesey might have written had he been born late and sent to Iraq sober. In its review of the blog's censorship and consequent scandal, the Washington Post is perhaps most attuned to Gallagher's youth and naivete. He is introduced as, quote, a scrawny boy from Reno who went to war, whose writings are raw, maddening, and hilarious. Dissimilarly, reviews of the book, the book version, are decidedly different in their evaluation of both text and author. The Boston Globe situates the narrative in a long line of canonical American writing that illuminates the fog of modern war. Kakutani in the New York Times, quote, takes seriously the range and registers and handles and deftness in handling both the tragic and the comic. Publishers Weekly waxes classical, inviting comparisons to Homeric epic and noting Gallagher's insights about the, quote, power of war to transform. So ultimately, we must ask, are the blog and the book that different? We might say no. Edits, emendations, and reductions are copious, but the prevailing themes, tone, and overall content are very much the same. In closing, let us consider a brief passage from each text, the published end version. From Riverbend in the summer of 2006, quote, Emily Dickinson wrote, hope is a thing with feathers. If that is what she wrote, and it is true, then hope has flown very, very far from Iraq. End quote. And from Gallagher, originally composed in the winter of 2008, quote, clouds of red puff dance brilliantly with the violet horizon, casting the Shia mosques as aptly as winter could allow. It was so easy to get caught up in the horrors of the moment, I thought, that the most vivid beauties of existence faded into eternal loops of gray. Time to take a deep breath and capture a mental snapshot. It's what a responsible individual does in times like this. The now of nowness kicked, end quote. We should understand such gorgeous, rich prose for what it is, not the spontaneous product of young savants or anomalous prodigies, but rather the result of careful composition and collaboration, of multiple drafts and editing, of processes that begin with a single author at work in front of a blog, but that are only credentialed and disseminated through engagement with larger institutions. Taking this approach will do a better service, not only to the authors, but to our students as they struggle through the text to understand them. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that very, very interesting look at two very different contributions to that broad genre of narratives, blog narratives about war and where they go. I'm sure that we'll have people with lots of questions and comments, but we've only got a little bit of time, so I'll just take a couple of questions if we have any coming through on the Q&A. In the meantime, though, I was thinking how that was a really interesting quote that you cited around the ground zero of narrative as it goes from as consciousness turns into memory, and I was thinking about how that actually how consciousness turns into memory operates so differently across those two different spaces, because one is shaped by other narratives, say of the military and other military blogs, and the other one, the Riverbend blog, is shaped by a very different set of experiences of consciousness. And I wondered if you had any commentary about that thought.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I mean, I always understand them sort of next to one another, as one is the story of occupation and one is the story of being occupied. And you're right in that there are other narratives or other forces sort of behind the scenes acting upon both authors as they're writing. And I suppose this isn't a full answer to your question, but I suppose the one lament I have is, of course, that Riverbend couldn't have the same opportunity as Gallagher or as other bloggers, right? To come forward, to do the press circuit, right? To expand more on what was said. It really is, we just have this textual artifact that that we get no elaboration or clarification from. And I think this is because of those other narratives, of course, acting upon her.
Yeah, great. We have a question from Amanda who asks, can you comment on the issue or problem of preservation and accessibility for these texts?
Yeah, I can only comment a little bit, I suppose, but the Wayback Machine, as I mentioned, is sort of the only way that these are digitally preserved. Especially for Riverbend's blog, which doesn't have a sort of, or didn't have a large Western press advocating for it in the beginning. It really is just sort of a miracle that it wasn't deleted. In terms of actual text, right? I don't know what the publishing industry in Iraq was like or has since been, but I imagine that that access and preservation are much trickier. And so I have a lot of respect for anyone involved in that.
And can you just tell us a little bit more about the title of your talk? Asks Gillian.
Sure. So the title of the talk is a quote from Gallagher's blog, the initial unedited blog version, and I think it really speaks to his feelings in that moment of like, this blog was the only way he could gain control, right? He's sort of a character in a larger narrative, and he was perhaps trying to find a way to sort of write his way towards agency, right? If I can jot my thoughts down here, then I have some control of the narrative, which just really jumped out to me.
Excellent.